pavement scraped against her cheek, the cold concrete a stark contrast to the burning indignity flashing in her eyes. Standing over her was Officer Bradley Jenkins, chest puffed out, absolutely certain he had just subdued a dangerous criminal trespassing in an upscale neighborhood. He slapped the heavy steel handcuffs onto her wrists with a smug, self-satisfied grin, completely unaware that he had just signed his own professional death warrant, because the woman he had just shoved into the dirt wasn't a vagrant or a thief. She was Valerie Thompson, the newly appointed Chief Prosecutor of the city, and she was about to make him wish he had never put on the badge. The morning air in Oak Creek Estates was crisp and laced with the scent of fallen pine needles. It was the kind of affluent, meticulously manicured suburban neighborhood where the lawns looked like golf courses and the driveways were paved with imported cobblestone. Valerie Thompson took a deep breath, pulling the collar of her grey fleece jacket up against the autumn chill. She had just closed on a sprawling 4-bedroom colonial at the end of Elmwood Drive the previous afternoon. After months of grueling courtroom battles and the exhausting political theatre of her recent appointment, she had wanted nothing more than a quiet, early morning walk to appreciate her new sanctuary. Dressed in simple black sweatpants, running shoes, and a faded university beanie pulled low over her braids, she looked like anyone else out for a Saturday morning stroll. But to Officer Bradley Jenkins, she looked like a target. Jenkins was a 12-year veteran of the force, a man whose career was held together by a fragile web of police union protection and a precinct culture that looked the other way. He had a thick personnel file overflowing with citizen complaints, mostly involving excessive force and racial profiling, but his commanding officers had always managed to sweep them under the rug. Riding shotgun next to him in the patrol cruiser was Officer Kevin Walsh, a rookie just 3 weeks out of the academy, who was quickly learning that the realities of the street under Jenkins's tutelage were vastly different from the textbook procedures he had been taught. "Slow down, Walsh," Jenkins barked, tapping his thick fingers against the dashboard. His eyes narrowed, locked onto the figure walking down the sidewalk 100 yards ahead. "Look at this." Walsh eased his foot off the accelerator. "Look at what, sir?" "It's just a woman walking." "She doesn't belong here," Jenkins sneered, his tone dripping with a prejudiced certainty that made Walsh's stomach churn. "Oak Creek is old money. Corporate executives, surgeons, judges. You see someone who looks like that, wandering around aimlessly in baggy sweats looking at houses? She's casing the neighborhood for package thefts or looking for an unlocked back door. Pull over." "Sir, she's literally just walking on the public sidewalk." "I said pull the damn car over, Walsh," Jenkins snapped, his face flushing red. The cruiser's tires chirped against the curb. Before the vehicle had even fully stopped, Jenkins threw his door open and stepped out, adjusting his heavy utility belt to ensure his hand rested intimidatingly close to his service weapon. "Hey, you there? Stop right where you are," Jenkins shouted across the pristine lawn. Valerie paused, turning around with a calm, measured expression. She watched the burly officer march toward her, his posture aggressive, his chin jutted forward. She had spent 2 decades in the criminal justice system. She knew every nuance of the law, every statute of civil rights, and she instantly recognized the dangerous cocktail of arrogance and bias radiating from the man approaching her. "Can I help you, officer?" Valerie asked, her voice steady and articulate. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Jenkins demanded, stopping just 2 feet from her, intentionally invading her personal space. "Where are you coming from?" "I'm taking a morning walk," Valerie replied coolly. "Is walking a crime in Oak Creek?" "Don't get smart with me," Jenkins growled, his eyes scanning her up and down with blatant disrespect. "We've had a string of burglaries in this area. You fit the description of a suspect we're looking for. I need to see some ID. Right now." Valerie didn't flinch. She knew exactly what game this was. "Officer, unless you have reasonable, articulable suspicion that I have committed, am committing, or am about to commit a crime, I am not legally obligated to identify myself to you under the state's stop and identify statutes. I am simply walking down the street." Jenkins blinked, momentarily thrown off guard by her precise use of legal terminology, but his surprise quickly mutated into furious indignation. He despised citizens who knew their rights, and he especially despised being challenged by someone he had already deemed beneath him. "Listen to me very carefully." Jenkins stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I am the law out here. When I tell you to hand over your ID, you hand it over. Now give me your name and your driver's license, or I'm taking you in for obstruction and resisting a lawful order." Rookie Officer Walsh had stepped out of the cruiser by now and was standing a few paces back, shifting uncomfortably. Jenkins, maybe we should just—" "Shut up, Walsh!" Jenkins snapped, not breaking eye contact with Valerie. "I will not provide my identification," Valerie said, her tone absolute iron. "You have no probable cause. You are conducting an unlawful stop based on blatant racial profiling, and I suggest you step back and return to your vehicle before you make a mistake you cannot undo." The sheer authority in her voice should have been a massive red flag. A smart cop would have recognized that the woman standing before him carried herself with the untouchable confidence of someone who wielded real power. But Jenkins was not a smart cop. He was a bully, blinded by his own ego and unchecked authority. "All right, that's it. You're done," Jenkins snarled. He lunged forward, grabbing Valerie's right arm with bruising force. "Take your hands off me immediately," Valerie commanded, instinctively jerking her arm back from his violent grip. "Stop resisting," Jenkins bellowed, a phrase he used purely for the benefit of his body camera, despite the fact that Valerie was merely standing her ground. Before Valerie could utter another word, Jenkins swept his heavy boot behind her legs and shoved her upper body forward. The world tilted violently. Valerie hit the concrete hard, her breath leaving her lungs in a sharp gasp as her cheek scraped against the rough pavement. Pain flared in her shoulder, but the physical sting was completely eclipsed by a cold, calculating rage. Jenkins dropped his knee hard into the center of her back, pinning her to the ground. He yanked her arms behind her, the metal cuffs biting savagely into her wrists as he ratcheted them far tighter than necessary. "You people always have to do it the hard way," Jenkins hissed under his breath, leaning close to her ear. "You think you can come into a nice neighborhood and talk back to me? You're going to learn respect today." Valerie didn't scream. She didn't cry out. She simply turned her head, her dark eyes locking onto the lens of Jenkins' body camera, etching the officer's name and badge number into her eidetic memory. Officer B. Jenkins, badge 4082. She was going to destroy him. The ride to the 42nd precinct was suffocatingly tense. Valerie sat in the molded plastic seat of the cruiser's rear compartment, her posture rigidly upright despite the awkward, painful pull of the handcuffs behind her back. She remained completely silent. In the front seat, the atmosphere was thick with unease. Walsh drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror. He looked pale, visibly shaken by the unprovoked violence he had just witnessed. Jenkins, however, was practically vibrating with misplaced triumph. "Did you see that, Walsh?" Jenkins bragged, adjusting the collar of his uniform. "That's how you establish dominance on the street. You give an inch, they take a mile. She thought she could spout some textbook legal garbage at me and walk away. Now she's catching a felony resisting charge." Walsh swallowed hard. Jenkins, I didn't see her doing anything wrong. She was just walking, and she knew the statutes. What if she's a lawyer or something? Jenkins threw his head back and laughed, a harsh, grating sound. A lawyer? Her? Please. She probably memorized a couple of lines off a daytime TV show. She's a nobody, Walsh. Just another loudmouth who thinks the rules don't apply to her. By the time I'm done writing this report, she'll be begging for a plea deal. Valerie listened to every word, filing it away. She mentally drafted the civil rights violation indictment as the cruiser navigated the city streets. She wasn't just a lawyer. 2 weeks ago, she had been sworn in as the district's Chief Prosecutor, overseeing a staff of over 300 attorneys and investigators. She was the absolute highest legal authority in the county, a woman who routinely dined with the mayor and had the power to indict police chiefs. And this beat cop had just assaulted her. The cruiser pulled into the gated sally port of the 42nd Precinct. Jenkins hauled Valerie out of the back seat by her upper arm, roughly dragging her toward the heavy steel doors of the booking area. "Keep moving," he ordered, giving her an unnecessary shove forward. The booking room of the precinct was a chaotic symphony of ringing phones, shouting officers, and clacking keyboards. As Jenkins marched Valerie toward the elevated front desk, a few heads turned, but most officers ignored the routine sight of an arrest. Behind the high desk stood Sergeant Miller, a weary, grey-haired veteran who was methodically stamping paperwork. "Got a live one for you, Sarge," Jenkins announced loudly, slapping his hand on the counter. "Jane Doe, refused to identify. Trespassing, obstruction of justice, resisting arrest, and assaulting a police officer." Walsh, standing a few feet behind them, flinched. "Assaulting an officer," he whispered under his breath. Valerie hadn't even raised a hand. Sergeant Miller sighed, not looking up from his forms. "Put her in holding cell 3. I'll get the fingerprint scanner ready to figure out who she is." "I can save you the trouble of the fingerprints, Sergeant." Valerie spoke for the first time since she had been thrown to the ground. Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried a razor-sharp, chilling authority that immediately cut through the ambient noise of the room. Something about her tone made Sergeant Miller freeze. He slowly looked up, his eyes adjusting to the bright fluorescent lights. He looked at the woman in the dirty sweatpants, taking in the bruised cheek, the dirt on her fleece jacket, and the steel cuffs digging into her wrists. Then he looked at her face. Miller's jaw went completely slack. All the color instantly drained from his weathered face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He dropped his pen. It clattered loudly against the wooden desk. "Oh my God," Miller whispered, his voice trembling. Jenkins chuckled, misinterpreting the sergeant's shock. "I know, right? Thinks she's the Queen of Sheba." "Shut up, Jenkins," Miller hissed, his voice suddenly frantic. He scrambled out from behind the high desk, nearly tripping over his own boots in his haste. "Shut your damn mouth!" Just then, the door to the commanding officer's suite swung open. Captain Richard Sterling, the precinct commander, stepped out, holding a mug of coffee. He was in the middle of a sentence, talking over his shoulder to a detective. "Make sure those warrants are signed by noon. I don't want any delays from the DAs." Captain Sterling turned his head. His eyes landed on Jenkins, then drifted to the woman in handcuffs. The coffee mug slipped from Sterling's hand. It shattered on the linoleum floor, hot coffee splashing everywhere. The entire booking room went dead silent. The phones seemed to stop ringing. Dozens of officers stopped in their tracks, staring at their captain, who looked as though he was staring down the barrel of a loaded shotgun. "Jenkins," Captain Sterling breathed, his voice hollow, echoing in the quiet room. "What have you done?" Jenkins looked back and forth between his pale sergeant and his terrified captain, a genuine look of confusion crossing his face. "Captain." It's just a routine collar. Suspect was casing Oak Creek, became belligerent. Take those handcuffs off her, Sterling commanded, his voice suddenly roaring through the precinct like a thunderclap. Take them off her right now! Jenkins physically recoiled. Captain, she assaulted me. If you do not remove those cuffs in 3 seconds, Jenkins, I will draw my sidearm and arrest you myself, Sterling screamed, sprinting across the room. Jenkins, hands shaking violently, fumbled for his keys. He unlocked the cuffs, the metal snapping open. Valerie brought her arms forward, slowly rubbing the deep red, bleeding indents on her wrists. She didn't rub her bruised cheek. She stood tall, her posture immaculate despite her ruined clothes. She looked directly at Captain Sterling, who was visibly sweating. Captain Sterling, Valerie said, her voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. I see the 42nd Precinct is maintaining its usual standard of community policing. Madam Prosecutor, Sterling stammered, his voice breaking. He looked like he wanted to fall to his knees. Miss Thompson, I have no words. I cannot express how... The words hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Madame Prosecutor. Ms. Thompson. Behind Valerie, Jenkins stopped breathing. His brain short-circuited as the title registered. The arrogant sneer melted off his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked at the woman he had just shoved into the dirt, the woman he had mocked, the woman he had falsely charged with felonies. He hadn't arrested a nobody. He had just assaulted Valerie Thompson, the Chief Prosecutor, the woman who controlled every criminal charge, every police indictment, and every grand jury in the entire county. Prosecutor, Jenkins whispered, his voice cracking like a terrified child's. His knees visibly buckled, and he had to grab the edge of a nearby desk to stay standing. Valerie slowly turned around to face him. Her eyes were devoid of pity, burning with the cold fire of absolute justice. Officer Bradley Jenkins, Valerie said, pronouncing his name slowly, letting the dread sink into his bones. You are not just suspended. You are finished, and before I am done with you, you will understand exactly what the law actually means. The silence in the booking room of the 42nd Precinct was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. It was the kind of quiet that follows a bomb dropping in those split seconds before the shockwave hits. Officer Bradley Jenkins stood frozen, his hand still hovering near his utility belt, his face the color of wet ash. His mind, usually quick to formulate excuses and defensive posturing, was completely blank. The woman staring back at him, bleeding from the wrists and bruised on the cheek, was Valerie Thompson. She wasn't a vagrant. She wasn't a thief. She was the apex predator of the city's legal ecosystem. Madam Prosecutor, Captain Richard Sterling stammered again, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket to dab at his profusely sweating forehead. He took a hesitant step forward, ignoring the shattered coffee mug and a dark puddle seeping into his polished shoes. Please, let us get you to my office. We can get a medic in here immediately to look at those wrists. This is a horrific misunderstanding, a colossal mistake. A mistake, Captain? Valerie's voice was dangerously quiet, slicing through the tension like a scalpel. A mistake is filing the wrong paperwork. A mistake is misreading a license plate. What your officer did was not a mistake. It was an aggravated assault under color of law, false imprisonment, and a flagrant violation of my civil rights. There is no misunderstanding here. I thought she was casing the neighborhood, Jenkins blurted out, the panic finally breaking through his paralysis. His voice pitched upward, desperate and whining. She was in Oak Creek. She refused to ID herself. I was following standard protocol for a non-compliant suspect. Protocol. Valerie whipped her head toward him, her dark eyes flashing with an intensity that made Jenkins physically recoil. You demanded identification without reasonable, articulable suspicion, a direct violation of Brown versus Texas. When I exercised my Fourth Amendment right to refuse your unlawful demand, you violently assaulted me, placed me in handcuffs, and falsified charges of resisting arrest. Do not insult my intelligence by calling your prejudiced, aggressive thuggery protocol. Jenkins opened his mouth to argue, but Captain Sterling spun on him. Shut your mouth, Jenkins, not another word. Sterling turned back to Valerie, his hands clasped together in a pleading gesture. Miss Thompson, please, let's handle this internally. I will personally suspend him pending a full review. I'll have the union rep down here in 10 minutes. We don't need to turn this into a media circus. Valerie didn't move. She didn't accept the offer of the office. She stood exactly where Jenkins had dragged her, ensuring every officer in the room and every security camera overhead captured the reality of the situation. We are not handling anything internally, Captain Sterling, Valerie stated, her tone echoing with finality. I want the Chief of Police on the phone. I want the State Bureau of Investigation down here immediately to secure the body camera footage before anyone in your IT department accidentally loses it. And I want the head of my Public Integrity Unit, Sarah Higgins, dispatched to this precinct right now. Sterling swallowed hard, realizing the catastrophic scale of the disaster. Yes, Mum. Right away. Furthermore, Valerie continued, her gaze locking back onto Jenkins, who looked as though he was going to vomit. Officer Jenkins is a flight risk and an immediate danger to the public. He has demonstrated a complete disregard for the law. Captain, I am instructing you to strip him of his badge and his service weapon. Now. Jenkins gasped. You can't do that. I have union rights. I want my representative. You will get your representative, Bradley, Valerie said coldly. But right now, you are being disarmed. Captain? Sterling didn't hesitate. Survival instinct had completely overridden any loyalty he had to his patrolman. He marched over to Jenkins. Give me your weapon, Jenkins, and your badge. Captain, you can't be serious. It's me, Jenkins pleaded, his hands trembling as he hovered over his holster. I've got 12 years on the force. You're going to let this... Hand it over, or I will charge you with insubordination and forcefully disarm you, Sterling hissed, his eyes wide with frantic urgency. With shaking hands, Jenkins unclipped his holster and handed over his Glock. He unpinned the silver shield from his chest, badge 4082, and dropped it into his captain's waiting palm. The metallic clink sounded like a death knell in the quiet room. From the back of the room, Rookie Officer Kevin Walsh watched the scene unfold with a mixture of terror and dawning realization. He had felt sick to his stomach since the moment Jenkins shoved the woman to the pavement. He had known it was wrong, but the toxic culture of the precinct and the fear of retaliation had kept him silent. Now, watching the untouchable Jenkins crumble, Walsh knew he was standing at a crossroads that would define the rest of his life. Valerie's sharp gaze shifted past the disgraced veteran and landed on the young rookie. Officer Walsh, isn't it? Walsh jumped, his posture snapping to attention. Yes, ma'am. You were the secondary officer on the scene, Valerie said, her tone slightly less abrasive but still commanding. You witnessed the entirety of the interaction. I presume your body camera was also activated? Yes, ma'am. It was, Walsh said, his voice surprisingly steady despite his racing heart. Good, Valerie nodded. You have a choice to make, Officer Walsh. You can toe the thin blue line, regurgitate whatever fabricated narrative Officer Jenkins is currently spinning in his head, and go down as an accessory to his crimes. Or you can remember the oath you took to uphold the Constitution, write a completely truthful incident report, and save your career. Which is it going to be? Jenkins shot Walsh a venomous, threatening glare. "Keep your mouth shut, rookie. Union rules." Walsh looked at Jenkins, then at the bleeding wrists of the Chief Prosecutor. He thought about why he had become a cop in the first place. He took a deep breath. "I'll write the truth, ma'am," Walsh said loudly, his voice carrying across the booking room. Officer Jenkins initiated an unlawful stop. You were not acting suspiciously. You were entirely peaceful. He escalated to physical violence without provocation. Jenkins let out a roar of absolute betrayal, lunging toward Walsh. "You little rat, I'll kill you!" Before Jenkins could cross the distance, Sergeant Miller and 2 other officers tackled him, slamming him hard against the holding cell bars. "Get him in a cell!" Sterling screamed. "Lock him up!" As the heavy steel door of holding cell 3 slammed shut, echoing with the finality of a coffin lid closing on Jenkins' career, Valerie Thompson finally allowed herself a small, grim smile. The trap was set. Now, the hammer would fall. By 8 a.m. on Monday morning, the city was completely upside down. Valerie Thompson had not gone home to rest. She had spent the entire weekend operating out of the State Bureau of Investigation's downtown headquarters, a secure facility far out of the reach of the local police union's influence. She had invoked a specialized independent counsel, bringing in David Rosenberg, a notoriously ruthless former federal prosecutor from out of state, to handle the direct indictment, ensuring there could be no claims of a conflict of interest on her part. Bradley Jenkins had spent the weekend sitting in a county jail cell, a reality he still couldn't fully comprehend. The police union president, Thomas "Tommy" Gallagher, had initially stormed down to the precinct, demanding Jenkins be released on his own recognizance, pending a standard administrative review. Gallagher was a loud, aggressive man who was used to bullying district attorneys into dropping excessive force charges. But Gallagher had never dealt with a victim who held the keys to the kingdom. When Gallagher demanded Jenkins' release, Rosenberg had simply slid a laptop across the table and hit play, the high-definition body camera footage from both Jenkins and Walsh played in agonizing detail. It showed Valerie walking peacefully. It captured Jenkins's sneering, racially charged dialogue. It clearly documented the exact moment Jenkins violently swept her legs out from under her, driving his knee into her spine while she was completely unresisting. Gallagher had watched the video in total silence. When it finished, he closed the laptop, stood up, and walked out of the room without saying a single word. He knew a sinking ship when he saw one. By Sunday night, the union had officially issued a statement declaring they would not be providing legal representation for Jenkins, citing egregious violations of department policy. Jenkins was completely on his own. On Monday morning, the news officially broke. Valerie had deliberately scheduled a press conference on the steps of the county courthouse. She wore a pristine, tailored navy blue suit. She had refused to use makeup to cover the dark purple bruise blossoming on her cheekbone, and she intentionally kept her hands unclasped in front of her, allowing the bandages on her wrists to be clearly visible to the sea of flashing cameras. On Saturday morning, I experienced a reality that far too many citizens in our community face on a daily basis. Valerie spoke into the cluster of microphones, her voice strong and unwavering. I was targeted, unlawfully detained, and violently assaulted by a sworn officer of the law. I am the Chief Prosecutor of this city. If an officer felt emboldened to do this to me in broad daylight, in an affluent neighborhood, imagine what is happening to those who do not have the platform, the legal knowledge, or the power that I possess. The journalists erupted into a frenzy of shouted questions, but Valerie simply raised a hand, silencing them. Officer Bradley Jenkins has been officially terminated from the police force, effective immediately, she continued, dropping the first bombshell. Furthermore, A special grand jury was convened yesterday afternoon. They deliberated for less than 20 minutes. Officer Jenkins has been indicted on charges of felony aggravated assault, felony false imprisonment, official misconduct, and deprivation of civil rights under the color of law. He is currently being held on a $1 million bond. The collective gasp from the press corps was audible. $1 million bond for a police officer was unprecedented. It was the kind of bail reserved for cartel bosses and flight risk murderers. Inside the county jail, Jenkins watched the press conference on a small mounted television in the common area. He was wearing an oversized orange jumpsuit, a stark, humiliating contrast to the authoritative uniform he had worn just 48 hours ago. His fellow inmates, several of whom he had personally arrested and mocked in the past, were watching the television, and then slowly turning their heads to look at him. "Man, you really messed up this time, Jenkins," a heavily tattooed man named Hector whispered from across the metal table, a malicious grin spreading across his face. "You put hands on the boss, lady." Jenkins felt a cold sweat break out across the back of his neck. His arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by a suffocating, paralyzing terror. He scrambled to the payphone on the wall, his hands shaking so violently he could barely dial the number for his private defense attorney, Robert Kessler. "Kessler, you gotta get me out of here," Jenkins pleaded the second the lawyer answered. "The judge gave me $1 million bail. I don't have $100 grand for the bondsman. You have to file a motion to reduce it." Kessler sighed heavily on the other end of the line. "Brad, I'm going to be honest with you. I just got off the phone with Judge Caldwell's clerk. The judge isn't going to budge on the bail. The state is arguing you are a danger to the community, and given your disciplinary file, which Prosecutor Thompson has just unsealed and released to the public, by the way, they have a massive amount of evidence to prove it." "She unsealed my file?" Jenkins gasped, the air leaving his lungs. His personnel file was his darkest secret. It contained 18 separate complaints of excessive force, 3 settlements the city had paid out quietly to avoid lawsuits, and documented instances of racial slurs used during arrests. The precinct captains had always buried it to protect the department's image. Now, it was public record. "It gets worse," Kessler said grimly. "Thompson's office has announced a look-back initiative. Because you have been indicted for falsifying charges and lying on an official police report, the district attorney's office is legally obligated under the Brady rule to review every single arrest you have ever made." "What does that mean?" Jenkins whispered, feeling the walls of the prison literally closing in on him. "It means they are going to overturn the convictions of dozens, maybe hundreds of people you put in jail," Kessler explained, his voice devoid of any comfort. "Every drug bust where you claimed you smelled marijuana. Every resisting arrest charge where there was no body cam footage. They are throwing it all out. The city is preparing for a tidal wave of civil rights lawsuits. The mayor is furious. The chief of police is throwing you completely under the bus to save his own job." Jenkins sank down against the concrete wall, the rough cinder blocks scraping through his thin orange jumpsuit. "Brad?" Kessler's voice softened, but it offered no hope. "You need to prepare yourself. We aren't fighting to get your job back. We aren't even fighting to keep you out of prison. With the federal civil rights charges they're threatening to tack on, we are fighting to keep you from dying in a federal penitentiary. Do you understand me?" The line went dead. Jenkins let the heavy plastic receiver slip from his fingers, dangling by its metal cord. He looked down at his own hands, the same hands that had violently shoved Valerie Thompson to the pavement, the same hands that had clamped the steel cuffs around her wrists with such vicious, arrogant glee. Karma hadn't just knocked on his door, it had kicked it down, dragged him out by the collar, and thrown him directly into the nightmare he had spent his entire career inflicting upon others. And the worst part was, the true legal slaughter in the courtroom hadn't even begun. The air inside courtroom 302 was sterile and bitterly cold, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the media circus camped outside the heavy oak doors. 6 months had passed since the incident in Oak Creek Estates. 6 months that had aged Bradley Jenkins a decade. He sat at the defense table, his massive frame significantly diminished, the tailored suit his attorney had provided hanging loosely off his shoulders. The arrogant, chest-puffing patrolman was gone, replaced by a twitchy, hollow-eyed shell of a man who jumped every time the heavy wooden doors clicked shut. At the prosecutor's table sat David Rosenberg, the special independent counsel Valerie Thompson had appointed. Rosenberg was a legal shark, a man who moved with terrifying quiet precision. Valerie herself sat in the gallery, directly behind the prosecution table. She wore a striking crimson power suit, a visual reminder of the blood Jenkins had drawn. She sat perfectly still, her presence dominating the room without her having to utter a single word. The trial had been a bloodbath from day one. Defense attorney Robert Kessler had tried every trick in the book, attempting to suppress the body camera footage, filing motions for a change of venue, and even trying to argue that Jenkins had suffered a momentary psychological break due to job stress. Judge Harrison Caldwell, a no-nonsense jurist with a reputation for mercilessly punishing corrupt officials, had systematically denied every single motion. But Kessler had one desperate play left. He had called Captain Richard Sterling to the stand as a character witness, attempting to paint Jenkins as an overzealous but dedicated officer whose actions were a tragic anomaly rather than a pattern. Captain Sterling sat in the witness box, wearing his formal dress uniform, his chest adorned with medals. He looked deeply uncomfortable, his eyes darting anywhere but toward Valerie Thompson. "Captain Sterling," Kessler began, pacing before the jury box. "You were Officer Jenkins' commanding officer for 5 years. In that time, did you ever know him to be a man who intentionally violated the civil rights of the citizens he swore to protect?" Sterling cleared his throat, adjusting his collar. "No, sir. Bradley was a tough cop. He worked the hard beats. Sometimes things get physical on the street. But I always believed he acted within the bounds of his training. The incident with Prosecutor Thompson was a terrible misjudgment, but it was not born of malice." Kessler nodded, turning to the jury to let the lie settle. "A terrible misjudgment. Thank you, Captain. No further questions." Rosenberg slowly stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He didn't walk toward the witness box. Instead, he leaned casually against his table, locking eyes with the sweating captain. "Captain Sterling," Rosenberg's voice was smooth, dangerously polite. "You just testified under oath that you believed Officer Jenkins always acted within the bounds of his training, and that this assault was an isolated misjudgment. Is that correct?" "Yes, that's my professional opinion," Sterling replied, his voice wavering slightly. "I see," Rosenberg said. He turned to his paralegal and accepted a thick, bound folder. "The defense has attempted to paint Officer Jenkins as a victim of a stressful job. But let's talk about the culture of the 42nd Precinct, Captain. Let's talk about what you knew and when you knew it." Sterling swallowed hard. "I don't understand the question." "Let me clarify," Rosenberg snapped, the politeness vanishing. "Your Honor, the state introduces Exhibit 42B, a series of internal precinct emails subpoenaed directly from the precinct's encrypted server." Kessler leaped to his feet. "Objection. We have not seen these emails." The defense was provided these in Discovery File 809 last night, Your Honor. Rosenberg countered effortlessly. Counsel's failure to read them is not my problem. Overruled. Proceed, Mr. Rosenberg, Judge Caldwell rumbled, leaning forward with sudden, intense interest. Captain, Rosenberg read from the top sheet, his voice echoing in the dead silent courtroom. An email sent from your official account to the precinct union representative, dated exactly 2 years ago. Quote, Jenkins crossed the line again with that kid on 4th Street. He broke the suspect's jaw while he was cuffed. The family is threatening to sue. We need to bury the use of force report and classify it as an accidental fall, or the brass downtown is going to have my head. End quote. A collective gasp swept through the gallery. Jenkins buried his face in his hands. Sterling gripped the edges of the witness stand, his face turning an alarming shade of crimson. Captain Sterling, Rosenberg roared, stepping toward the box like a predator, closing in on wounded prey. Did you or did you not actively conspire to cover up a felony assault committed by Bradley Jenkins 2 years prior to his attack on Valerie Thompson? Sterling stammered, realizing he had just walked blindly into a devastating perjury trap. Furthermore, Rosenberg didn't let him breathe, pulling another sheet. We have 18 similar emails, 18 cover-ups. You didn't just know he was a violent, prejudiced liability, Captain. You enabled him. You protected him. So, I ask you again, under the penalty of perjury, was his assault on the Chief Prosecutor an isolated misjudgment? No, Sterling whispered, his career shattering into a million pieces on the courtroom floor. No, it wasn't. The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel, demanding order, but the damage was irreversible. Valerie watched from the gallery, a cold satisfaction settling in her chest. She hadn't just put Jenkins on trial, she had put the entire corrupt hierarchy of the 42nd Precinct on the stand, and she had just broken their backs. The fallout from Captain Sterling's disastrous testimony was swift, brutal, and historic. Within 48 hours of his admission of a systematic cover-up, the mayor forced the chief of police into an early, disgraced retirement. Sterling himself was indicted for perjury, obstruction of justice, and tampering with public records. But the hardest hammer fell on Bradley Jenkins. The jury deliberated for exactly 45 minutes. When the foreman stood and read the verdicts, guilty on all counts, including the severest charge of deprivation of civil rights under color of law, Jenkins didn't even flinch. He was completely numb, his spirit thoroughly crushed beneath the relentless, crushing weight of the legal system he had once manipulated for his own amusement. Sentencing day arrived beneath a bleak, overcast sky. The gallery was no longer filled just with reporters. Valerie had personally ensured the front 2 rows were reserved for the citizens Jenkins had falsely arrested over the past decade. The Brady List victims. Dozens of men and women whose lives had been derailed by Jenkins' lies sat in silent, dignified judgment. Judge Caldwell looked down from the bench, his expression etched with profound disgust. Bradley Jenkins, Caldwell's voice filled the room, heavy with righteous anger. You were entrusted with a badge and a gun. You were given the power of the state to protect the vulnerable. Instead, you acted as a tyrant. You terrorized the citizens you were sworn to serve, hiding behind a blue wall of silence that this court has finally torn down. Jenkins stood beside his lawyer, trembling slightly, his eyes glued to the floor. The irony is not lost on this court, Caldwell continued. You believed you were untouchable because you targeted those you thought had no voice. You made the catastrophic error of targeting the one woman who possessed the power to expose your entire rotting ecosystem. This was not a mistake. It was an inevitability. The judge adjusted his glasses. For the crimes of aggravated assault, false imprisonment, and official misconduct, I sentence you to 12 years in the state penitentiary. Furthermore, because you violated the civil rights of Ms. Thompson under the color of law, this sentence will run consecutively with the federal sentencing guidelines currently being prepared by the Department of Justice. 12 years. Hard time. No possibility of parole for at least 10. A heavy, definitive silence hung in the room before the bailiffs moved in, clamping the heavy iron shackles around Jenkins' wrists and ankles. The clinking of the chains was the only sound as they turned him around to lead him out. As he shuffled toward the side door, Jenkins' eyes met Valerie's in the gallery. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply looked right through him, treating him with the exact same dismissive insignificance he had shown her on that sidewalk 6 months ago. He was no longer a threat. He was just a convicted felon. But Valerie's work was far from over. Jenkins' conviction was merely the spark that ignited a massive, cleansing fire through the city's justice system. Back in her sprawling corner office at the district attorney's headquarters, Valerie stood looking out over the city skyline. Beside her stood Sarah Higgins, the fierce head of the Public Integrity Unit, holding a stack of thick files. "The federal consent decree has been signed, Valerie," Sarah reported, dropping the files onto the mahogany desk. "The Department of Justice is taking oversight of the 42nd Precinct. We've relieved 42 officers of duty pending internal investigations. The toxic culture Sterling built is being completely dismantled." Valerie turned away from the window, her expression resolute. "What about the victims?" "The exoneration project is moving at light speed," Sarah smiled, a genuine expression of relief. "Because of the Brady Rule disclosures triggered by the Jenkins trial, we've filed motions to vacate the convictions of 114 individuals, people who were framed, coerced into pleas, or subjected to illegal searches by Jenkins and his unit. They are going home, Valerie. We're clearing their records." "And Officer Walsh?" Valerie asked, referencing the rookie who had told the truth. "He caught a lot of heat from the union hardliners," Sarah noted. "But with Gallagher ousted from the union presidency after the PR nightmare, the moderates took over. Walsh has been transferred to the Community Outreach Bureau. He's safe, and he's doing good work." Valerie nodded slowly, sitting down at her desk. She touched her cheekbone. The physical bruise had faded months ago, but the memory of the concrete scraping against her skin remained an indelible driving force. She pulled a fresh legal pad toward her and uncapped her pen. She had used a horrific act of personal violence to pry open a corrupt system, weaponizing her own trauma to deliver justice to hundreds of voiceless citizens. Bradley Jenkins had thought he was putting a random woman in her place. Instead, he had handed the Chief Prosecutor the exact crowbar she needed to tear his entire corrupt world to the ground. Karma had not just circled back, it had fundamentally rewritten the laws of the city. 18 months after the heavy iron doors of Marion Correctional Institution slammed shut, the reality of maximum security confinement had thoroughly broken whatever remained of Bradley Jenkins's spirit. He spent 23 hours a day in protective custody, locked in a windowless 8x10 concrete cell. As a former police officer, he was a massive target in the general population, surrounded by the very men he and his corrupt unit had once unlawfully brutalized. His only interactions were the venomous threats whispered through the air vents at night and the cold, indifferent stares of the corrections officers who saw him not as a brother in blue, but as a disgrace to the badge. Yet Jenkins clung to one final, desperate sliver of hope. He had a secret. Over his 12 years on the force, Jenkins had routinely pocketed cash from drug busts, extorted small business owners in the commercial district, and skimmed off the top of civil asset forfeitures. He had quietly funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into an offshore account under a dummy corporation, and he owned a pristine, secluded luxury cabin in Lake Tahoe, purchased entirely with dirty money under his brother-in-law's name. Jenkins told himself that if he could just survive the next 10 years, he would get out, move to the mountains, and live out his days in comfortable, wealthy obscurity. He believed he had outsmarted them all. He was dead wrong. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, Jenkins was shackled and escorted to the prison's sterile visitation room. He expected to see his ex-wife, Brenda, who had filed for divorce the day after his sentencing, but occasionally managed his meager commissary funds. Instead, waiting for him behind the thick, smudged plexiglass was a severe-looking man in a sharp grey suit holding a heavy leather briefcase. Jenkins picked up the plastic telephone receiver. "Who the hell are you?" "My name is Gregory Finch," the man said, his voice clipped and entirely devoid of empathy. "I am a state-appointed liquidator working in conjunction with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the District Attorney's Financial Crimes Division." Jenkins felt a cold lump of dread form in his stomach. "Financial crimes? My criminal trial is over. I'm already doing the time. You can't touch me anymore." Finch opened his briefcase and pulled out a towering stack of legal documents, pressing the first page against the glass. "You underestimate Chief Prosecutor Valerie Thompson, Mr. Jenkins. She didn't just want you behind bars. She wanted to dismantle the entire infrastructure of your corruption. When the city's liability fund was drained paying out civil settlements to the 114 victims you falsely imprisoned, Prosecutor Thompson initiated a deep-dive forensic audit into your personal finances." "You have no right." Jenkins slammed his shackled fist against the glass, startling the guard standing in the corner. "My finances are sealed." "Not when they are tied to a racketeer-influenced and corrupt organization's indictment," Finch corrected smoothly, turning to the next page. "Prosecutor Thompson assigned an elite forensic accountant named Sylvia Croft to your case. Ms. Croft is remarkably thorough. She found the offshore shell company. She traced the wire transfers from the commercial district extortions directly to your brother-in-law's accounts." Jenkins stopped breathing. The sterile room seemed to spin. "Under the RICO statutes," Finch continued, mercilessly delivering the final blow, "the federal government has seized all of your assets. The Lake Tahoe property was raided and seized last Thursday. Your offshore accounts have been frozen and repatriated. Furthermore, your ex-wife, Brenda, has fully cooperated with the federal authorities in exchange for total immunity. She surrendered the remaining clean assets, meaning your pension has been formally stripped and redirected to the victims' restitution fund." "No," Jenkins whimpered, his knees going weak. "No, you can't take the cabin. You can't take the money. That's all I have left." "You have nothing left, Mr. Jenkins," Finch said, neatly packing his documents back into his leather briefcase. "You have no property. You have no pension. Your commissary account has been zeroed out to pay court fees. You are completely, unequivocally bankrupt. Prosecutor Thompson sends her regards." Finch hung up the receiver and walked away, leaving Jenkins sobbing into the plastic phone, the sheer totality of his absolute ruin finally crashing down upon him. He had tried to steal Valerie Thompson's dignity, and in return, she had surgically stripped him of his freedom, his career, his family, and every single cent he had ever stolen. 200 miles away, under the bright, clear skies of the city, Valerie Thompson stood at a podium erected in front of the county courthouse. The bruising on her cheek was a distant memory, replaced by the radiant, untouchable confidence of a leader who had fundamentally changed her city for the better. Before her stood a massive crowd of journalists, city officials, and community leaders. Sitting in the front row was Jamal Peterson, the young man whose jaw Jenkins had broken years ago. a man who had just received a life-changing settlement check funded directly by the seizure of Jenkins' illicit offshore accounts. Beside Jamal sat Officer Kevin Walsh, recently promoted to detective, serving as a testament to the fact that integrity could still thrive in the department. Today, we do not just celebrate the closing of a dark chapter in our city's history. Valerie's voice rang out through the speakers, commanding and resolute. We celebrate the dawn of a new era of accountability. I am proud to announce the creation of the Oak Creek Justice Initiative. The crowd erupted into applause. This initiative, funded entirely by the $4.2 million in illicit assets seized from corrupt officials over the past 18 months, will provide full law school scholarships to underprivileged youth in our community, Valerie declared, her eyes sweeping over the crowd. We are taking the resources hoarded by those who abused the law, and we are placing them directly into the hands of those who will protect it. She paused, letting the profound weight of the moment settle over the audience. True justice is not just about punishing the guilty, Valerie concluded, looking directly into the primary news camera, knowing full well that somewhere, locked in a dark cell, Bradley Jenkins might be watching. It is about using the wreckage of corruption to build a foundation of absolute equity. It is about ensuring that no one, no matter how powerful, is ever above the law. And it is about reminding every single citizen that when you stand your ground, the truth will always be your strongest shield. The applause that followed was deafening, a roaring, tidal wave of vindication that washed over the city. Valerie Thompson stepped away from the podium, her legacy cemented forever. The pavement where she had once been violently shoved was no longer a site of humiliation. It was ground zero for the greatest legal reckoning the city had ever seen. What begins as an arrogant display of power can quickly transform into a masterclass in absolute justice. Officer Bradley Jenkins believed he was untouchable, preying on those he deemed powerless while hiding behind a corrupt badge. But he made the fatal mistake of targeting Chief Prosecutor Valerie Thompson, a woman who didn't just know the law, she commanded it. The hard karma that hit Jenkins wasn't just poetic, it was entirely systemic, stripping him of his freedom, his hidden wealth, and his legacy, while using his dirty money to fund a brighter future for his victims. If this story of righteous retribution and legal domination hit the spot, please smash that like button and share this video with someone who loves seeing bullies get exactly what they deserve. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our thrilling real-life karma stories. We want to hear from you. Did Jenkins get the exact punishment he deserved, or was losing his hidden money the absolute best part? Drop a comment below and let us know.